I remember the exact moment everything shattered. We were standing in my backyard, paper plates balanced on laps, the smell of grilled chicken mixing with fresh-cut grass. It was supposed to be a celebration. Clara had insisted on hosting a family barbecue to bring everyone together. My son Jacob stood near the fence, talking quietly with his cousin. He looked uncomfortable in the crowd, but he'd shown up. That alone felt like progress after months of tension between him and Clara. Then she raised her glass. Everyone went quiet, expecting some sweet toast about family and new beginnings. Clara smiled that practiced smile of hers and said, "Well, everyone makes mistakes in life." She paused for effect. Alan's just happens to have a name. The words hung in the air like poison. My chest tightened. A few people laughed nervously, unsure if it was a joke. But I saw Jacob's face drain of color. He set down his plate without a word and walked straight through the side gate. I couldn't move. My feet felt bolted to the ground. Clara giggled, sipping her wine like she just told the funniest story at a cocktail party. But I knew what I'd seen in my son's eyes. Humiliation, betrayal, and worst of all, confirmation that he didn't belong in his own father's home anymore. The drive home was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Jacob sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, arms crossed tight against his chest. I kept glancing over, trying to find the right words. Nothing came. The silence pressed down on both of us like a heavy blanket we couldn't shake off. Finally, I cleared my throat and said, "She didn't mean it like that." My voice sounded weak even in my own ears. Jacob didn't turn his head. He just said quietly, "Yes, she did." Those 3 words hit me harder than any yelling could have. He wasn't angry. He was resigned, like he'd been waiting for this moment all along. When we pulled into the driveway, he got out before I even turned off the engine. I sat there alone, gripping the steering wheel, replaying Clara's toast over and over. How had I missed the cruelty in her tone? How had I let it get this far? Inside, Jacob went straight to his room and locked the door. I stood outside in the hallway, hand raised to knock, but I couldn't do it. What would I even say? That my wife didn't respect him? That I'd been too blind to see it? I walked away and sat on the couch in the dark, feeling like the worst father alive. 3 days later, Clara announced she wanted to fix things. She planned an apology dinner, without asking me first. She invited Jacob, ordered catering, and set the dining room table like we were hosting royalty. Candles, cloth napkins, the whole performance. Jacob came only because I begged him to. He sat across from Clara, his face blank and unreadable. She stood at the head of the table and delivered what I can only describe as a scripted speech. She talked about family, unity, and moving forward. Her words were polished but empty, like she'd rehearsed them in front of a mirror. Then she ended with, "So let's all start fresh, okay?" She smiled brightly and sat down, expecting applause. Jacob picked up his fork, stared at his plate, and muttered, "You started it." The air went cold. Clara's smile flickered. I felt my hands clench under the table. She tried to laugh it off, saying something about teenage attitudes, but the damage was done. We ate in silence. Every clink of silverware felt like a small explosion. After dinner, Jacob thanked me quietly and left. Clara spent the rest of the night complaining that he was ungrateful. I didn't argue. I just nodded and wondered when I'd stop standing up for my son. A week later, I found a letter tucked inside an old book Jacob had left on the coffee table. It wasn't meant for me. It was from his late mother, my first wife, written years ago when Jacob was still in elementary school. The paper was worn soft from being folded and unfolded too many times. She wrote about how proud she was of him, how gentle and thoughtful he'd always been. She reminded him to stay kind even when the world wasn't kind back. Reading her words felt like a punch to the chest. I'd spent so long trying to move forward after losing her that I'd forgotten who I used to be. Back then, I was calm, protective, present. I put Jacob first in everything. But somewhere along the way, Clara's charm had blinded me. Her confidence, her social ease, her ability to make me feel like I was living again. I'd mistaken that for love. Now, sitting alone with that letter in my hands, I realized I'd been so focused on not being lonely that I'd let someone hurt the one person who mattered most. I folded the letter carefully and put it in my wallet. I needed to remember who I was before Clara. I needed to find my way back. At work the next Monday, a colleague named Tom pulled me aside in the break room. He looked uncomfortable, like he didn't want to say what he was about to say. "Alan, I don't know if this is my place, but your wife's been talking a lot about your family." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "She told a few people at that charity event last month that Jacob's troubled and ungrateful. Said he makes things hard for you." My blood went cold. I tried to brush it off. Told Tom it was probably a misunderstanding. But later that afternoon, I overheard two women from accounting whispering near the copy machine. One of them said Clara's name. The other said something about a difficult stepson. I walked past like I hadn't heard, but my mind was racing. Clara had been painting Jacob as the problem. To my colleagues, to people I worked with every day, she was rewriting the narrative, making herself the victim and my son the villain. That night, I didn't say anything to her. I just watched. The way she smiled when she talked about her day. The way she carefully avoided mentioning Jacob, unless I brought him up first. I was starting to see the cracks in the mask. 2 weeks after the apology dinner, Jacob called me from his friend's apartment. His voice was steady but distant. "Dad, I'm staying here for a while." My stomach dropped. "Jacob, wait. We can talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about," he said quietly. "I just can't stay in a house where I'm not wanted." I tried to argue, tried to convince him to come home, but he'd already made up his mind. The next day, I came home to find his room half empty. Clothes gone, books gone. The posters he'd had on his walls since middle school were rolled up and leaning against his desk. On his pillow, there was a handwritten note. "I love you, Dad. I just can't stay where I'm unwanted." My hands shook as I read it. I sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the empty walls. Clara came in behind me and sighed. "He'll be back when he calms down," she said casually, like he'd just gone to the store. I didn't respond. I couldn't. For the first time since marrying her, I felt a wall go up inside me. Something had shifted, and I wasn't sure I could ever see her the same way again. A week later, Jacob called me at work. His voice was tight, like he was holding something back. "Dad, you need to see this." He sent me a photo of a printed email. My hands were shaking as I zoomed in to read it. It was from Clara's account, sent to her mother a month before our wedding. The subject line read, "Final thoughts." The message was short and cold. "Once Jacob's out of the way, Alan will finally focus on me. He's too sentimental about the kid, but that'll change once we're married. I just need to be patient." I read it 3 times. My stomach turned over. Jacob's voice came back through the phone. "I found it in a box she left at your place last year. I wasn't snooping. I was looking for an old charger." I couldn't speak. My throat had closed up. "Dad." "I'm here. I finally managed. I'm so sorry, Jacob." "It's not your fault," he said quietly. "But now you know." I hung up and sat staring at my computer screen. The words burned into my brain, out of the way, like my son was an obstacle, a problem to be solved. I felt sick. That night, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe Clara had been stressed before the wedding. Maybe she didn't mean it the way it sounded. Maybe it was taken out of context. I wanted so badly to believe there was an explanation. But then I noticed something else in the email Jacob had sent. At the bottom, there was a second recipient, Monica Alvarez, Clara's college friend. She'd copied someone else. That meant it wasn't just a private vent to her mother. She'd shared her plan with a friend. It was deliberate, calculated. I pulled out my laptop and started going through old emails, looking for anything else I might have missed. I found a thread from 2 years ago where Clara joked with Monica about landing the grieving widower. My chest tightened. Another email mentioned my financial situation, my insurance policy, even Jacob's college fund. She'd done her homework. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark, trying to process what I was seeing. The woman I'd married wasn't who I thought she was, and I had no idea how deep the lies went. A few days later, Clara and I got into an argument about money. She wanted to redecorate the living room again, and I'd suggested we wait until next month. She snapped at me, her voice sharp and impatient. "You're being naive, Alan." The word hung in the air. I looked at her, and for a split second, I saw panic flash across her face. She realized what she'd said. She tried to backtrack, laughing it off, saying she was just stressed about work. But it was too late. I'd heard the contempt in her voice. Naive. Like I was a fool she had to manage. That night, I started watching her more carefully. Not obviously, just quietly observing. I noticed how she checked her phone constantly and angled the screen away from me. I noticed how she changed the subject whenever I mentioned Jacob. I noticed how she scheduled her mother's visits without asking me first, like it was her house and I was just a guest. Something inside me hardened. I wasn't going to confront her yet. I was going to wait, watch, and gather the truth piece by piece. Over the next 2 weeks, I became someone I didn't recognize. I checked our shared bank accounts and found transfers I didn't remember approving. Small amounts at first, then larger ones to an account in her name only. I stayed up late after she went to bed, listening to her phone calls through the thin walls. She talked to her mother in hushed tones about timelines and next steps. I started going through paperwork in my office, documents I hadn't looked at in months. That's when I found the updated will. My signature was on it, but I didn't remember signing it. Jacob's college fund had been redirected. The house would go to Clara if something happened to me. My life insurance beneficiary had been changed. Everything pointed to one conclusion. She'd been planning this for a long time, and I'd been too trusting, too desperate to move on from grief to see it. I made copies of everything and stored them in a safety deposit box at the bank. I didn't know what I was going to do yet, but I knew I needed evidence, just in case. That weekend, Clara's mother Sylvia came to visit. She arrived with 2 suitcases like she was moving in. Sylvia was just like Clara, polished, sharp-tongued, and cold underneath the charm. At dinner, she made a comment about Jacob. "I'm glad he's staying elsewhere," she said, cutting her chicken. "He was a distraction from your new life. Alan, you deserve to focus on your future." I set down my fork slowly. "Jacob is my future." Sylvia smiled thinly. "Of course. I just meant it's healthier for everyone this way." Clara nodded in agreement, and I saw it clearly then. They were the same person. Same arrogance. Same lack of empathy. Same belief that other people were pieces on a board to be moved around. I excused myself early and went to my office. I called Jacob and told him I loved him. He sounded surprised, but he said it back. After I hung up, I sat there staring at the wall. I was done pretending. I just needed the right moment. A few days later, I reached out to Dr. Marlene Cobb, an old friend who used to work with Clara years ago. We met for coffee at a quiet cafe downtown. Marlene was direct, no nonsense, and I'd always trusted her. After small talk, I asked carefully, "Did Clara ever talk about me before we got married?" Marlene hesitated, then sighed. "Alan, I debated telling you this. But yes, she used to brag about marrying up and how you'd be perfect for polishing her public image." My stomach sank. She said that more than once. She talked about your reputation, your stability. I thought it was just talk, but after you two got engaged, I started wondering. I thanked her and left. But before I got to my car, Marlene called after me. "If you need a witness, Alan, I'll help you." I nodded. Something was forming in my mind now. Not revenge, just truth. And I was going to make sure everyone saw it. 2 days later, Jacob called again. "Dad, I found more." He'd made a backup of Clara's old emails before she deleted her account last year. He sent me a flash drive in the mail. When it arrived, I plugged it in with shaking hands. One folder was labeled Final Prep, Wedding. Inside were dozens of files. Notes on how to charm my colleagues. Strategies for handling Jacob. Tips on managing my perception of her. She'd even written a timeline for when Jacob would naturally want to move out. There were screenshots of texts with Monica planning how to subtly isolate me from old friends. There was a file about my finances, including my late wife's death benefits. My hands were trembling. This wasn't love. It wasn't even opportunism. It was a con, a long, calculated con. And I'd walked right into it. I copied everything onto a second drive and locked the original in my desk. Then I sat back and stared at the ceiling. I needed to be smart about this. Careful. I wasn't going to blow up. I was going to dismantle her piece by piece. That evening, I confronted Clara. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I just held up the flash drive and asked calmly, "What is this?" Her face went pale. "Where did you get that?" "Does it matter?" She tried to deny it at first, saying Jacob must have faked it. Then she switched tactics, tears streaming down her face. "Are you really going to believe your son over your wife?" I didn't answer. I just stood there, watching her performance. When she realized I wasn't reacting, she changed again. Anger now. "You've always chosen him over me. I'm your wife, Alan." I turned and walked to the guest room. I locked the door and lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in months, I felt clear. I knew exactly what I was dealing with, and I wasn't going to let her win. Clara insisted on marriage counseling. She scheduled an appointment and told me we needed to work through this together. I agreed, but 2 days before the session, I met with a therapist privately. I showed her the emails, the financial records, the timeline. The therapist, a woman named Dr. Paulson, listened carefully and took notes. "This is beyond typical marital conflict," she said quietly. "This is manipulation." When the actual session came, Dr. Paulson asked Clara directly, "Have you ever tried to manipulate Alan's relationship with his son?" Clara froze. She opened her mouth, then closed it. The silence stretched out painfully. Finally, she said, "I think Jacob's influenced him against me." Dr. Paulson didn't blink. "That's not what I asked." Clara looked at me, then at the door. She didn't answer. The session ended early. On the drive home, Clara was silent. She knew the mask was slipping. A week later, I told Clara I wanted to do something special for our anniversary. A big dinner. Family, friends, colleagues. A celebration. Her face lit up. "Like renewing our vows?" I smiled. "Something like that." She threw herself into planning it. Picking the venue, designing the invitations, choosing the menu. She thought it was her moment to shine, to prove to everyone that we were the perfect couple. I let her believe it. Meanwhile, I reached out to Jacob. I told him the plan. At first, he was hesitant. "Dad, are you sure?" "I'm sure," I said. "It's time everyone knew the truth." He agreed. Marlene agreed to come as a witness. Everything was in place. Clara had no idea what was coming. And for the first time in months, I felt like I was in control of my own life again. The night of the anniversary dinner, the room was packed. Clara wore a stunning dress and worked the crowd like a politician. She laughed, hugged people, told stories. She was in her element. Halfway through the meal, I stood and tapped my glass. Everyone went quiet. "I want to thank you all for coming," I said, "and I want to give my son Jacob a chance to say a few words." Clara's smile faltered slightly, but she clapped along with everyone else. Jacob stood, his face calm but serious. "I want to thank Clara," he began, "for everything she's done for me." He pulled out his phone and connected it to the projector we'd set up for toasts. The screen flickered to life. And there it was, the email. "Once Jacob's out of the way, Alan will finally focus on me." Gasps filled the room. People leaned forward, reading the words projected in huge letters on the wall. Clara's face drained of all color. She stood up, knocking over her wine glass. "That's fake. Jacob made that up." But I stood and held up the flash drive. "It's real, Clara. Timestamp files. All of it." The room erupted. People were whispering, pointing, pulling out their phones. Clara's voice rose, shrill and desperate. "You're all believing a manipulative teenager over me?" But then Marlene stood from her seat in the back. "I'm Dr. Marlene Cobb. I worked with Clara 5 years ago." She told me directly that she was targeting Alan for financial stability and social status. The room went silent again. Clara's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. She tried to laugh, to deflect, but her hands were shaking. This is insane. You're all insane. She looked around the room, searching for an ally. No one met her eyes. Her mask had finally fallen. The charm, the warmth, the practiced smile, it was all gone. In its place was raw desperation and anger. She pointed at Jacob. He poisoned all of you against me. Jacob didn't flinch. He just said quietly, I didn't have to. You did it yourself. Clara grabbed her purse and stormed toward the door, but she stopped when she realized no one was following her, not even her mother. Sylvia had been sitting near the back, her face tight with panic. She stood up suddenly and shouted, You told me he was just a temporary solution until you secured your inheritance. The room exploded again. People turned to stare at Sylvia, who immediately realized what she'd just admitted. She tried to backtrack, but it was too late. Clara spun around, her face twisted with fury. Shut up, Mother. But Sylvia kept talking, desperate to save herself. I told you this was too risky. I told you to wait. But you rushed everything. Clara's last shred of credibility collapsed. Even the people who'd been on the fence were now staring at her with disgust. She looked at me one last time, her eyes filled with something between hatred and disbelief. Then she turned and walked out. Sylvia followed, still talking, still making excuses. The door slammed behind them. The room was silent for a long moment. Then someone started clapping. Slowly, others joined in. They weren't clapping for drama. They were clapping for truth. Jacob and I left the venue together. We didn't say much. We just walked to the car in silence, the cool night air washing over us. Behind us, I could hear Clara's voice in the parking lot, yelling at her mother. I didn't look back. For the first time in years, I felt light. Not happy, not yet, but free. Jacob got into the passenger seat and looked over at me. You okay, Dad? I nodded. I will be. We drove home, and I realized that the house didn't feel like a prison anymore. It felt like a starting point. Clara had tried to erase my son, control my life, and rewrite my story, but she'd failed. The truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deep you try to bury it. That night, I sat in the living room with Jacob, and we talked for hours about his mom, about mistakes, about moving forward. It wasn't a perfect conversation, but it was honest, and that was enough. The divorce was filed quietly 2 days later. My lawyer said it would be one of the easiest cases he'd ever handled. With the emails, financial records, and witness testimony, Clara had no leverage. She tried to fight it at first, demanding alimony and half the house. But when her lawyer saw the evidence, he advised her to settle quickly. The court sided with me on everything. Clara got nothing. No house. No savings. No claim to anything I'd built before or during the marriage. Jacob's college fund was restored. My will was corrected. Every manipulation she'd carefully constructed was undone in a matter of weeks. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt tired. But it was a kind of tired that comes after finishing something hard. Not the exhaustion of being slowly drained by someone else. Jacob moved back home. His room was exactly as he'd left it. He didn't say much, but I saw the relief in his eyes. We were starting over, and this time, no one was going to come between us. A few weeks after the divorce was finalized, I started hearing rumors. Clara was trying to spin the story, telling people I'd turned Jacob against her, that the evidence was exaggerated. She played the victim in every conversation, painting herself as the misunderstood wife who'd been blindsided. But Marlene wasn't going to let that stand. She released a public statement, along with copies of additional messages Clara had sent bragging about her plans. The messages were damning. Clara's professional reputation collapsed almost overnight. Her job let her go quietly. Her social circle evaporated. Even Monica, her so-called best friend, distanced herself publicly. I didn't take any pleasure in watching it happen, but I didn't stop it either. She'd built her life on lies. Now she had to live with the consequences. Jacob asked me once if I felt bad for her. I thought about it and said, no, I feel bad that I didn't see it sooner. One evening, my phone rang. It was Sylvia. Her voice was shaking, and she was crying. Alan, please. We went too far. I'm so sorry. Clara's a mess. Can we just talk? I sat there for a moment, listening to her sob. Then I said calmly, "No, Sylvia, you got exactly what you wanted. Attention, control, a plan. You just didn't expect to lose." I hung up. She tried calling twice more. I blocked the number. I wasn't interested in apologies that came only after consequences. Jacob was in the kitchen, making a sandwich. He looked up when I came in. "Was that her?" I nodded. She wanted to apologize. Jacob raised an eyebrow. "What did you say?" I said no. He smiled a little. "Good." We sat at the table and ate together in comfortable silence. It felt like the first normal moment we'd had in over a year, and I realized that this right here was what mattered, not the drama, not the revenge, just peace. Over the next year, Jacob and I rebuilt everything. We went to therapy together, not because things were broken, but because we wanted to make sure they stayed strong. We took a trip to the mountains, something we used to do with his mom. We renovated the old family cabin his mother had loved, tearing out the rotted boards and replacing them with new ones. We painted the walls. We fixed the porch. It felt symbolic, like we were rebuilding ourselves too. Jacob started college in the fall. He called me every Sunday. We talked about classes, friends, life. He was thriving. One night, he told me, "Mom would have been proud of how you handled everything." I felt my throat tighten. "She'd be proud of you, too." "I know," he said quietly. "I just wish she was here." "Me too," I said. We sat on the phone in silence for a while after that, both of us thinking about her. But it wasn't a sad silence. It was full, warm. We were okay. And that was enough. A year after the anniversary dinner, I attended Jacob's college graduation. He walked across the stage in his cap and gown, and I cheered louder than anyone else in the crowd. Afterward, we went to dinner with some of his friends. At the end of the meal, I raised my glass. "To mistakes," I said. "Some teach us pain. Some teach us the truth. But all of them make us who we are." Jacob smiled and clinked his glass against mine. "To the truth," he said. Everyone at the table raised their glasses and echoed him. I looked at my son, strong and confident and free, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Pride, not just in him, but in myself, for choosing the hard path, for standing up when it mattered, for protecting the person who mattered most. Clara's name was never mentioned again. She was a memory now, nothing more, a chapter that had closed. And as we left the restaurant that night, walking into the warm spring air, I realized something. I didn't need closure. I didn't need revenge. I just needed this, my son beside me, the truth between us, and a future we were building together. That was enough. That was everything.